Welcome, good evening to the YouTube channel of Instituto Cervantes in Manchester and Leeds. First of all, I would like to extend a warm welcome to our guest tonight, is Dr. Nicholas R. Jones and Professor Rosi Song. Thank you for joining us in this fifth event of the series of Ex Libris publications in Hispanic studies. This project has been developed, we are now in our second year, in cooperation with Professor Rosi Song, who is Deputy Head of a School of Modern Languages and Culture at the Durham University. In this series, we try to discuss and to think about the recent works on the topic on contemporary Hispanic culture and British and American academia. Let me introduce our two hosts. The coordinator of the series, Professor Rosi Song, has published many works on contemporary Spanish culture, film, and literature. Some of her publications include Lost in Transition, Constructing Memory in Contemporary Spain, A Taste of Barcelona, The History of Catalan Cooking and Eating as co-author, Traces of Contamination, and Nerfield, the Francoist Legacy in Contemporary Spanish Discourse, and Towards a Cultural Archive of La Movida as co-editor. Her articles have appeared in the Journal of Spanish Cultural Studies, MLN, Revista de Estudios Hispánicos, Romance Notes, Hispamérica, Revista Hispano-Iberoamericana, and Hispania, among many others. Our special guest tonight is Dr. Nicholas R. Jones, who is Assistant Professor of the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at Yale University. He is the former King Juan Carlos I of Spain Center's Scholar in Residence in New York University 2021-2022, and is author of the book of prize winner book which we are launching tonight in this YouTube channel of Cervantes Institute, Habla de Negros, Radical Performances of the African Diaspora in Early Modern Spain, and also he is co-author of Early Modern Black Diaspora Studies, a Critical Anthology, published in 2018, and Pornographic Sensibilities, Imagining Sex and the Visceral in Modern and Early Modern Spanish Cultural Production with Chad Leahy. Dr. Jones also co-edits the Routledge Critical Junctures in Global Early Modernities book series with Derek Higginbotham. He has held visiting appointments in many universities, just to mention some of them, Georgetown University and New York University, and has also published widely in journals such as the Colonial Latin American Review, Hispanic Review, University of Toronto, and many others. As I have just said, we are launching tonight, and we will discuss about the book Habla de Negros, staging Habla de Negros, Radical Performances of African Diaspora in Early Modern Spain. The book has been published by Penn State University Press and is a book which has been widely acclaimed by critics, academics alike. In this volume, Nicholas R. Jones analyzes wide appropriations of Black Africa voices in Spanish theater on the Golden Century, and when the performances of the Africanized Castilian commonly refers as the Habla de Negros, which is a topic has traditionally been in the Spanish literature even from the Middle Ages. I have just read Alfonso X el Sabio had also so nice comments about the Black presence in the Spanish literature. But without further ado, in normal role to comment about the author of the subject, I give the floor to Rosi. Muchísimas gracias y enjoy the evening.
Thank you so much, Pedro Servio, for that warm welcome as always, and thank you so much, Nick, for joining us this afternoon. Thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to talk about your book that actually I really enjoyed reading, and I think it really is very significant in proposing and advancing new ways of thinking about this material that you engage with in this book. As somebody that works on contemporary Spain, this is always a treat to sort of reach back into time to have the opportunity to experience the kind of material that you bring into discussion. So let me just start right away. And I'm going to start by asking you to explain or define Habla de Negros. So what do you mean by that? And what does it refer to? And maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you became interested in them as we start this conversation about your book.
Sure, no, absolutely. Again, thank you for the gracious introduction and opening remarks. And so, essentially, I mean, Habla de Negros is, was in as early as the, arguably mid 1400s, well into the 1800s, and also as the term circulated globally across the Portuguese and Spanish empires, this term Habla de Negros, or even in the Portuguese Fogo de Preto, basically captured, described, identified, marked Africanized Castilian in the sense of Habla de Negros. It's referring to Africanized Castilian. As a translation, the translation of Habla de Negros that I use, in addition to Africanized Castilian, varies from, Black Talk. There are recent, publications that suggest and claim that the term Habla de Negros means Black speak. How did I come across this topic? I mean, obviously it was before my book Staging Habla de Negros. In a previous life, it was my doctoral dissertation at NYU. But even before that, I came across these Habla de Negros materials, practitioners of Habla de Negros, speakers of Habla de Negros, in an independent study that I did with the professor Kathleen Ross. And so at NYU, I'm not sure if the requirements in the curriculum have changed since my time, but we were required to take an independent study. And so I believe it was like during the spring 2016 semester, I knew that it was important to read and to be versed in the complete works of Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. And so I asked Kathleen Ross if she would be interested in doing this independent study with me. She said yes. And so for the final term paper, a seminar paper that I wrote for her in this independent study was essentially about Habla de Negros, but specifically in the villancicos of Sor Juana. And what stood out to me, and again, I didn't know reading this language, I was thinking to myself, what in the world is this? I don't understand it. Is it racist mockery? Is something else going on? What's up? What's happening with this language in this form, in this particular case, with this form of, for me at least, African diasporic speech acts, with my own theoretical arsenal and tool set coming from Black studies, Africana studies. I knew something was interesting and of value was happening, because if we think again more diasporically, more holistically, we know that in the African American tradition, again, from my own background and training, this light bulb went off. Okay, Langston Hughes works with this material. Many writers of the 19th century Black Renaissance are working, Zora Hurston, Langston Hughes, Paul Lawrence Dunbar. So on the African American side, and even diasporically thinking about, Afrocostumbrismo, thinking about Nicolas Guillen, thinking about Pales Matos, I knew the linguistic representations were there and that they existed, but I had no clue, no idea that we could trace and identify the chronology much, much earlier. And so, and after that, that's all she wrote. So, yeah.
That's really amazing. And actually, one of the interesting ways in you start sort of this story or these journeys is actually thinking about the otherness that language produces, right? So as you and I both engage in the work of languages that are not native to us, we also experience that otherness. So how do you relate that otherness to that language as not only sort of a marker of difference, but also in terms of performance, agency, and so on?
Right. I mean, I would say, as far as this experience of, being othered linguistically, and I go into details about this in the preface, and for me, outside of the specificity of the early modern texts that I work with and talk about in the book, in thinking and working across time, putting the early modern period in conversation with contemporary issues, that so-called otherness has profound implications, whether it's understood through the prestige of accents, the prestige of how well someone doesn't pronounce a word or construct a sentence, and vice versa. So that otherness, again, for me, in the way in which I approach theoretically and conceptually Habla de Negros, has a lot, it is informed by the present, and whether that present contemporary moment is understood through lived experience and clearly lived experiences, again, things that I talk about in the preface of the book.
Yes.
That many of us, whether you're a native or non-native speaker of whatever language, particularly Western language it is, how we are othered and hierarchized, that's a word, in language. And so for me, I think that that's one of the larger salient takeaways with thinking about how, each of us is othered, and even going back, thinking about many of the works of James Baldwin as well, and other larger debates with African American vernacular English, so on and so forth.
Yes, and actually, I'd like to take you to sort of that summary of that concept of language, because you describe your project actually as political, right? And I like to step out a little bit of the actual book, right? What your book intends to do. So can you explain or expand on how do you think your work is political, right? And what it hopes to achieve?
Yeah. No, great. A question that I get asked all the time. And for me, obviously when I say that this particular book, but I would say the profile and the interventions and the stakes of my complete research agenda and everything that I write and that I do has political implications, because for me, whether it's talking about and when I say political, I'm not referring to the binarized US American politics of, Republican versus Democrat. In other countries, obviously there are more than two political parties. But for me, what I mean by political, building off of and thinking about Vincent Brown's work in The Reaper's Grave, has a lot to do with the maneuverings and the machinations of how Black people across the diaspora speak back to, contest, manipulate, subvert anti-Black racism. That's one particular interpretation of the political We can even interpret that political as far as this identity, thinking about Jose Esteban Munoz's work and identifications, political in the sense of the work that Zora Neale Hurston has done so in many of her essays and writings and such. So I think for me, the political precisely has to do with the intentional maneuverings and machinations of one's positionality in the crazy world in which they lived, and we are still reckoning with and dealing with the legacies of those things, whether it's racism, sexism, homophobia, so on and so forth, classism, destruction of the environment. How does one see themselves in this world and the legacies that we've inherited across time?
Right, and in that sense, in that continuation of that conversation, you also actually engage in what you actually call a revisionist act, right? And I think that your use and definition of the word is actually perhaps different, because what you do in your work is put material that you work with an interesting context and conversation with theoretical frameworks that you wouldn't normally think of or align with. So there is a constant sort of back and forth between early modern and even modern and contemporary, and you create this sort of fluidity, right, between these ideas and perceptions that actually resonate against each other, and you create sort of these conductive, or maybe sort of a way in which you can link these times. So why do you think it's important to create sort of these connections? And actually, because you do create this arc in which through through which you can actually follow race, for example, right? And specifically in the context of our discipline. Why do you think that is important?
Right. I would say for the revision, I mean, I'll put it, there's so many ways to skin this cat and answer this very important question. With the revisionist, when I say that specifically in the case of, the book staging Habla de Negros is a revisionist project, I'm specifically calling out, taking to task the discipline at large, quite frankly. Criticism, specifically early modern Spanish criticism, but I would say the field at large, taking the field to task. Because again, for me, speaking as a Black person, I was, and with the revisionism and the revisionist work that my book embodies and it represents and it speaks about and speaks for, as a Black scholar, I was quite frankly tired of white scholars and non-Black scholars, and it's just not about white people, but non-Black scholars specifically telling me how to think about and how to write about Black people. And so that's part of that revisionism. I was tired, even as a grad student, and, being told that, to work on Black people or to work on race isn't going to get you a job. It has no value. It has no worth. It has no cachet. I was tired of those types of comments and opinions that are so much intertwined, and even still to this day, still enthralled and so much intertwined in the paternalistic ways in which the criticism about, in this case, Habla de Negros, or let's say whatever Black character that pops up in a given text, it's, for me, it's all, it overlaps. The paternalism and quite frankly, the hubris to assume and to suggest that a corpus, or in this case, to be concrete, the corpus of Habla de Negros materials and speech acts aren't worthy. And so in that revisionist work and in that revisionist work, that is one of the that represented and functioned as one of the primary goals to really undo and to hold the mirror up to the field.
Yeah, and I think that you actually do that work quite efficiently.
Yeah.
And I think that by bringing sort of these different ways of situating a work, you not only engage historically in that moment, but really you bring it to task, bring it up to the present, also bringing it back. So it actually is sort of a whirlwind, right, to follow your work and your thinking. And really, I think that the resonance of the strands that you pick up are actually quite remarkable. But one of the things that you do importantly in your book is you reset the presence of this habla de negros, right? So you move away from the traditional way of sort of categorizing this kind of writing or this kind of presence as something, in a way, very superficial, right? Is derogative, is just representational, is a portrayal. But you actually, what you make is a case for Black presence, both material and cultural. And then very quickly you go into agency because they exist, they matter, they do things, right? Why do you think this way of talking about Black presence matters?
Yeah. No, fantastic question. I would say that again, piggybacking off, what I just said about the revisionist work, the field needed it, honestly. I think it was a time, in one sense, the field of early modern, and specifically in early modern Hispanic or Castilian text and so on and so forth, the field needed it. For me, it's important to decenter Western European epistemologies about that presuppose and suggest and purport Black inferiority, Black degradation, so on and so forth. For me, it's important and necessary to center Blackness. What do I mean by centering Blackness? By, as I show and do in the book, thinking about ethnonyms, for example, and a lot of this work has been done and has been done and thought through with Lynn Midlow Hall, who recently, has passed on. But thinking in Paulie Lovejoy's work, even more recently, Jessica Marie Johnston's work, even thinking more historically and broadly of the work of Natalie Zeman Davis. For me, it's important to center Blackness in those ways, thinking about the foods that were consumed or perhaps prohibited, thinking about as I talk about in chapter 1 of the book, that's about Blackface and Black dances, again, centering specific embodied modes of expression. Again, to repeat and go back to the important work of Zora Neale Hurston and thinking about across time for centuries, the ways in which African and African descended people to combat anti-Black racism, to combat colonial violence, dispossession, so on and so forth, in these new so-called New World spaces, if you will, as problematic terms, the ways in which African and African descended people have adorned themselves, the ways in which, as I illustrate in chapter 2, signifying and speaking back, not just to one another, but speaking back to whites who are in power, who are, for all intents and purposes, subjugating them enslaving them, beating them, so on and so forth. Pulling from, again, specifically the theoretical work from Black performance critics such as Tavian Nyong'o, thinking about the ways in which Black dances are kinetic.
Right.
The
And
energy
speaking,
that comes, yeah.
yeah, going back to sort of that speaking back, and I think that you also trace, for example, the movement of music and the dances through the triangulation of the Caribbean and Cuba specifically. It's an amazing sort of map that you draw in your work. But also thinking about talking back, I want you to talk a little bit about the women that you discussed, the women characters that are talking about makeup, they are talking back, and actually they are themselves a fascinating window of to a life of that moment, right? That is so easy to just consider it either just noise or something that doesn't quite matter. It's a in between sort of divertimento in the middle of a larger work, but you actually bring our attention to those moments that actually present something that is interesting about the time.
No, precisely. And specifically with the chapter on Black women, specifically looking at two entremeses from Lope de Rueda with Eulaya and Guiomar. I would say, again, in brief, and especially now as I'm working on new projects and working on new themes, for me it's interesting in an uncanny way how the policing and the policing and all of the opining upon and about Black women's bodies has not changed. Because again, we have the arsenal of the criticism that has, we know what it says. And we know what some, scholars are still saying about these particular dangerous and racist tropes. But for me, what has informed, and again, specifically in the context of chapter 3 from the book on Black women, in isolating and doing close readings of makeup and clothing, the somatic, the body and such. As I kind of step back from the project and I'm realizing and seeing how honestly nothing has really changed in that regard of policing Black women's bodies. And in the case of Eulaya, we can see now it in our present day in popular culture, whether it's in R&B music, rap videos, rap music, the phenomenon of twerk in younger circles, the ways in which ratchet and ghetto were thrown around and tossed around and applied to both, Black and non-Black people. For me, that keep having that in mind informed and has informed my interpretation and handling of characters like in Eulaya, for example, who bleaches or wants to change or lighten her hair color as one example. Because again, there's a certain narrative that suggests that, for a Black woman who wants to wear or have blonde hair or wear a certain type of color of lipstick that doesn't match her dark skin, there's a certain narrative that wants to police and control and make claims about those types of decisions. And so for me, I saw an interesting overlap with certain narratives, whether stuff that I hear from my mother or my sister or other close friends of mine who are Black women, and we're talking about certain very particular topics that are happening and resonating in popular culture. For me, from those conversations and just listening, I saw something similar operating in certain instances and moments in those texts, I would say.
Yes, and I think that is quite true because as you read through your analysis, it really resonates with a lot of the cultural commentary that is going on right now. I mean, this does not feel foreign. This does not feel particularly a case of Spain, right, or the Hispanic world. And I think that you putting in conversation sort of centering this idea of that Black diaspora or African diaspora into sort of this Western context, you really do open these interesting points of connection. And I wanted to go back a little bit to that idea of what happens when white or Spanish writers actually use the Habla de Negros, because in a way that implicates them as well. Right? It's not only about mimicry, it's not only about sort of borrowing something. And if they actually do borrow, there is a reason for it, right? So I was wondering if you could explain a little bit about your reasoning, how you actually implicate these writers in producing this kind of work.
Oh yeah, thank you for that, for the next question and transition into the conversation. And that's precisely the point. Just as much as a conversation and a commentary can be made and had about just as much on the flip side, the question of whiteness, if it were, but also what's happening and how are these writers impacted by that Blackness was very important to me. While in the research that I was doing on the project, while writing the book, the analyses and the conclusions that I reached, and not to make, and again, not to recreate and reify, for me, these very elementary, one-dimensional, superficial readings of, oh, it's these, bad, mean, racist white people dehumanizing and animalizing Black people. No, for me, it's much more complex.
Mm-hmm.
There's much more nuance that needs to happen in our analysis and unpacking of these materials. Demographically, and examples of that, historically speaking, and with the demographics, if we know that during the reign of Philip II in Seville and both in Lisbon, the Black population was as high as 10 or 11%. You have some historians who are very generous and say 15%. In their Black population, 2022 that aren't not that high. I grew up in Seattle, Washington, and in the 90s and the 2000s, and perhaps even now, the Black population didn't even reach 1%. And so for me, my point with all of this is that if we follow the logic and follow the data that suggests that in a place like Seville is just one concrete example, and we can think about all of the many port cities across the Iberian Peninsula. We can think about also Castilla-La Mancha and other provinces and areas. But if we're having in Spain these high percentages of Black people, it's difficult for me to submit to the notion that this diasporic Blackness did not influence, shape, alter, confuse these non-Black populations. And when I say, and I'm very particular when I say non-Black, it's just not about European whiteness or your so-called white communities in Spain, but we have to think about the Islamic people, the Iberian Muslims, the North Africans who were sharing these same spaces, Sephardim, thinking about the Roma people and how in the Iberian Peninsula, in obviously in the Middle Ages, but in the early modern period in which the book is situated, how all of this overlaps and
Mhm.
how precise, again, how Blackness and Sub-Saharan African Blackness vibes off of and flex and deflex, so on and so forth, with the other racial and ethnic religious communities that were there in Spain at the time. And I think for me, this reductive idea that, oh, these bad racist white writers dehumanize Black people, for me, that's not enough. We know that narrative. It's nothing new. It's like we know, that's what I was trained to believe. I'm sure, Rosie, when you were, when you were doing your PhD, similar narratives were taught. And so, that's where I, in a stubborn way, stand with that. Yeah.
And I think you're absolutely right. So, right, we were in a way taught not to pay attention to sort of this kind of work. It was actually, you never really got to discuss, it was an entremés, you just skipped around and you went to the meat of the larger work or the considered important work. So I really enjoyed your working on sort of that materiality of the presence, sort of the trace, right? Because you are creating, sort of bringing into sort of that you're creating this connection to that world, at least creating some understanding of what could it be to be in Seville with 10, 15, 12% of, Black people living in the same sort of space, right? And those demographics actually cannot be ignored. So one of the things that I really enjoyed in your book that you do, and I think that you end with that reflection, is your consideration how actually Habla de Negros sounded like. So the sort of the oral experience of the Habla de Negros. And actually you make a very remarkable sort of connection there. And a very interesting actually geographic journey following what you think that will sound like. So can you share your experience with the audience?
Sure. So in the afterword, I talked about and discussed, like, speaking to, traveling again across time and geography, thinking about in an African diasporic sense and returning to Cuba specifically, but this phenomenon is and was present across the Caribbean, North America, even quite popular and present in Spain nowadays. But not to be coy, I'm specifically referring to La Regla de Ocha, the Lukumi, the Yoruba-based Lukumi, and also Congolese religious traditions and practices and such. And so in the research at that time, because obviously we don't know what this Habla de Negros sounded like. Obviously there are no recordings or anything of that matter. But what struck me was in scholarship written and produced by anthropologists and sociolinguistics and linguistic anthropologists writing about Bosov speech in either Lukumi, Afro-Cuban, Yoruba-based derived Lukumi communities with trance and the possession of Orisha, thinking about, broadly speaking, Espiritismo, the working of spirits, essentially, and in the realm of trance and spirit possession, I was kind of following the clues, the Scooby snacks, if you will, of what these anthropologists, linguistic anthropologists, sociolinguists were saying. And who I'm talking about, we can look at the work of Elizabeth Hartakainen, Stefan Palmier, I think that's University of Chicago, even Dylan Robbins, who's at NYU, a lot of his new fantastic work on sound studies and trance. Jill Lane's work as well, thinking about blackface in 19th century Cuba. For me, long story short, I thought for me, I said to myself, there's something there. And then also other types of research and ethnographic work that I have done in Cuba in these types of spaces and communities, pieces of that puzzle. I was beginning to find pieces to complete that puzzle of and about what, in this kind of subjunctive sense mode, what it might have sounded like, could have sounded like, it's conditional. And essentially, yeah, we're again privileging and highlighting, centering those types of theoretical
connections. Yeah.
Precisely, yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, and I think that it actually does really open up. I mean, I think it could be speculative, but it actually invites to speculation. I like to invite the floor, open the floor for questions from the audience that has been listening to us. And while I give them some time to either type in the chat box or maybe unmute themselves to ask the questions, while they get ready for that, Nick, I just wanted to ask you about your next project. I know that you are just finishing another book. Congratulations again. So what can we expect to learn about in your next book?
No, so I mean, it's no secret that I'm writing a book about that places Cervantes in conversation with sub-Saharan African Blackness, and the title of the book is punchy and short, Servantine or Servantine, depending on your linguistic preference. Servantine Blackness. And for me, at least, the quick elevator pitch is that it's a book that essentially traces, threads together Cervantes's complete works, even though in the book I highlight others more than other texts. But essentially, it's a project that traces and thinks about what Cervantes is doing within about sub-Saharan African Blackness, not necessarily or merely in the literary sense, but in his time, in his age. There's a chapter, I have a chapter on Maria de Sayas. So thinking about what and how writers, in this case of Maria de Sayas, this highborn woman writer, fits into that picture. And I mean, as we know, in curriculum and Spanish departments, especially if you're teaching and talking about the exemplary novels, Cervantes and Sayas are often twinned and put together. Yeah, so in short, it's a project that really, without giving away too many details, deals with those. I will say that it's very different than staging Habla de Negros. I will say that it's very, in the sense that I'm not preoccupied about representation, questions of representation and presence. I'm not really preoccupied about revising things and doing the type of revisionist work.
Okay.
So it's very different than staging Habla de Negros. Yeah.
Okay, looking forward to it. I think we have a question. Rebecca Ingram, you have raised your hand. Do you want to unmute yourself? And
Sure. Thank you, Rosi, and thanks, Nick. I am delighted to hear you talk about this work today. I'm sure this is the case for lots of us here, but my students at USD are hungry for the approach that you present to us in your book. It makes the people, the texts, and the context from long ago relevant to their interests in social justice and activism. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your classroom approaches, the primary texts you use, how you work with students with the theoretical frameworks that you also explore in your book. And thank you in advance.
Thank you. No, and yeah, terrific question. That it really varies. Obviously, whether you're working with undergraduates versus grad students. And this semester, I have the great pleasure of teaching both. And so this semester, I'm teaching a graduate seminar on Black Iberia. And so at the graduate level, it's a little easier or smoother doing this type of work. But I mean, my immediate answer is on both levels, for both undergraduates and graduate students. I mean, quite frankly, just encouraging reading. I mean, I feel, I mean, and I've had this conversation with other friends and colleagues, and perhaps it's snobby and elitist, but I feel as though a lot of people don't read enough, and particularly read outside of their field or their immediate training. And I would say at least one sort of nugget of wisdom that I impart to both, to all of my students, regardless, you know, if they're undergrads or not, is to read. I think that's so important, to read, and read outside of your comfort zone, read outside of genre, read outside of your field, because you learn, at least speaking for myself, I have learned so much about, perhaps at the level of writing itself, what works stylistically, what does not work stylistically, and aesthetically, and even just from the pleasure of reading itself, you learn, at least for, again, speaking for myself, I've learned just different types of techniques and approaches to conveying information, thinking about certain, I don't know, ideas, arguments, topics, especially with methodologically speaking. That has been really useful for me, reading what sociologists may have to say. I just talked about anthropologists and linguists, reading what they have to say, reading magazines, reading op-eds and such. So in short, that has been really useful, and that's a piece of advice and such that I impress upon my students across levels. As far as the text that I use, I know next in the spring, I'm offering a course on the Spanish Inquisition. So in a class like that, it'll be offered at the undergraduate level. So in a course like that, it's very easy to share with undergraduates what, you know, a dossier may look like, or what a type of historical record may look like, what the handwriting looks like, how do you, the paleography and such, and even have them do little mini exercises on how to, you know, trace and copy the scribe's hand or the penmanship. So that's one particular technique or exercise that I've done. So yeah.
So Rebecca says that she thanks you for those examples, that she says was fantastic. I don't know if there are other questions, if they want to unmute themselves and ask. So Blanca Garcia Puente, actually, thanks you so much for this insightful talk. And I would also just add, you know, as a sort of concluding remark, thank you everyone for having been here listening to Nick talk about his book and his project, actually, that perhaps, you know, the complexity to which you allude to doesn't mean that, you know, there's gotta be only one way of looking, you know, at this, you know, reality, right? I think that in every way we deal with the complexities and the complications, right? Yeah. Of this issue that touches us in very different ways, depending on where we are, with whom we're talking with, what we're studying, and so on. So understanding those intersections, the subtleties and the complications, I think is part of the training that we need to engage with. And I think that your book really does show us a way, right, to keep that sort of complication going, that doesn't have to be only about pessimism. It's not only about, you know, being an optimist either. It's about actually talking about, you know, how existence and how lived experiences happen and matter as legacies of our history. So thank you again. Francisco says, thank you. This is a foundational book for envisioning a richer and more diverse Spanish culture and its historical nature for now and for the future as well. Thank you so much. Thank you, Instituto Cervantes, for hosting us once again.
Thank you to you, Nicolas and Rosi. It was really wonderful talk. Very complex subject, but so interesting. And yes.
And we'll see you again in a month for our last book for the series this year.
The 8th of November, yes.
Yes, yes. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening and take care.
Thank you, Nicolas. Hoping having you for the next book.
Sounds good. I'm up for it.
Bye.